Welcome. Whether it's climate change, environmental degradation, or organized crime, a case can be made that cities around the world, including New York, are doing a better job than nation states at addressing problems and cooperating across borders. So today on the program, if mayors ruled the world, or good thing Congress doesn't pick up the garbage. Also today, to make room for the next generation, we will see winning designs for even smaller, but maybe better, apartments here in New York City. But before we get to all that, let's consider the future of the Catholic Church. On February 28th, as you probably know, Benedict XVI will no longer be Pope to the over 1 billion Catholics on earth, or the 2.5 million in the New York diocese. His surprise resignation sets up a struggle for succession that involves values, morals, and more. Joining us, Sister Camille D'Arienzo, a former president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Every Sunday for the past 40 years on 1010 Wins, a commentator. Also with us, Tim Reidy, digital editor of America Magazine. And via Skype, David Gibson, national correspondent for Religion News Service and author of The Rule of Benedict, Pope Benedict XVI and his battle with the modern world. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Sister Camille, where were you when you heard the news about the Pope's resignation, and what did you think?
Well, I was actually in my room getting ready to leave to go to Long Island to give a series of talks on forgiveness. And what I thought was, this is astonishing.
What's the buzz in the convent about what's coming next?
Well, the buzz in the convent isn't too much different from the buzz elsewhere, not among informed Catholics anyway. But I think that the general reaction was a sense of gratitude and admiration that he had the wisdom, the courage, the humility to say, I can't do this any longer. Someone else has to take over this. So I think anyone I heard speak did say that.
Tim, the wisdom, the courage, the responsibility. We were just talking off the air about he and John Paul II, who so publicly deteriorated physically until the end of his life, came to very different conclusions, but both as acts of conscience.
Yes, in many ways, theologically, the men were very, much the same or very close, but in the ways that they went about the papacy, they were very different. Very different, John Paul, very public. He was a former actor and athlete. More bookish, Benedict, a quieter personality. And it's the way that they approach the office as well. John Paul felt called to kind of follow it through the period of his suffering until he died. Whereas for Pope Benedict, he felt called to a very different path, which was to step aside and let somebody else take over.
And perhaps not to let the world see another Pope shuffling to his death.
Yes, and David, I wonder if there is something valuable about each thing. To see a Pope shuffling to his death, it was, I think, John Paul II's intention to kind of represent human decline as an important act. Whereas to step aside and let the church as an institution go forward was considered important by Benedict, both important in their ways.
Yes, you're exactly right. Both important in their ways, but John Paul, I think, was a bit more, shall we say, traditional in his way of viewing it, in seeing himself as a Christ-like figure. When he was asked about resigning, he said, "Did Christ come down from the cross?" That's the way the papacy has been viewed, and a lot of people were critical of that. They thought there was too much of a cult of the person of the Pope, kind of seeing the Pope as a sort of demigod or something. And I think it's a great irony, and I think it's a very salutary thing for the Church, that Pope Benedict, this most traditional and orthodox of men, of theologians and of popes, has done this kind of radical thing. It could be a one-off with him, but he's broken precedent that you're carried out, with your boots on from the papacy, that it's a job that you carry unto death. And it sort of shocked people, I think, not that he resigned, he gave signals that he would do that, but the fact that people suddenly realized that the papacy is an office, a very important one, the most important one perhaps in the church, but it is just an office that someone can pick up or lay down.
Does this mean he's no longer infallible after he resigns? He becomes fallible again?
No, well, infallibility, I think, is exaggerated and misunderstood. It's very, very rarely used. Obviously, he has a great authority when he speaks or issues documents, but infallibility has only been used 2 or 3 times actually in the history of the church. So this has nothing to do with fallibility or infallibility. It's, as Tim said, a matter of conscience.
Tim, can you name the 4 countries in the world with the most Catholics in order?
That's a good question. I think Brazil has got to be near the top
That's
of that
what I've
list.
got as number 1.
Number 1. Poland or Ireland? Well, they're
Sister
very
Camille,
largely Catholic.
Want to
but-
guess?
I'd never do numbers.
Dave, do you know?
Mexico?
Mexico is number 2.
Okay.
And the Philippines,
Philippines, okay.
3, and then the United States. And it strikes me, Sister Camille, that the issues that Catholics deal with on a day-to-day basis in Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines might be fairly different from those that people like yourselves in the United States deal with.
Well, I think if we look at some of the South American countries, and not only there, this is beginning to happen in the United States with greater frequency, we don't have enough ordained priests to offer the Eucharist to the people, to Catholics.
Is that an American problem or is that a global Catholic problem?
I guess it's a global Catholic problem, not as profound in the United States, but there are sections of the United States where there is not a priest, for many, many, many miles. And what is happening is people who deserve, as Catholics, to be fed by the Eucharist and by the knowledge of who Jesus is through the Catholic tradition, don't have that available. And so some are leaving the church, going to other churches, Pentecostal churches and whatever, finding their faith someplace else. And I think it is a failure of, the teaching arm of the church to neglect that because of adherence to traditional views such as an all-male celibate clergy. There are others who could fill the needs and spread the love and the presence of Christ, and they're just not being fed.
But Dave, what I hear is that people around this table may be having that conversation. Catholic intellectuals may be having that conversation. At the Vatican, they are not having that conversation. And the cardinals who are in line to potentially be the next pope themselves are elderly men, mostly European, mostly appointed by John Paul and some by Benedict, who are in the same mindset. And this is a serious discussion in the media in the United States. It is not a serious discussion in the Vatican. Do you think that's right?
To a degree, you're right, but I think you have to realize that I think the big choice coming up in the conclave is whether they're going to stick with a European monopoly on the throne of St. Peter, or whether they're going to reach out to someone, a cardinal from Latin America, Asia, or Africa, the southern hemisphere, where the church is booming, as opposed to the northern hemisphere, where it's stagnant or really declining in membership and participation. And while, again, there's a lot of talk about women priests teaching on contraception, gay marriage, that kind of thing, those things are not going to change. But a pope that comes from the southern hemisphere, I think, could have very different priorities. He could be much more open to changing the mandatory celibacy requirement, for example, which in of itself is simply church law, not a dogma that needs a council to change. And that could really address some of the problems that Sister Camille was talking about. But also, we're so focused on some of these, as we say, pelvic issues, which are certainly neuralgic and important. But in most of the world, and in the vast majority of the Catholic Church, it's issues of poverty and wealth, the gap between the wealthy and the poor. And to have a pope from the Southern Hemisphere, the developing world, make that his focus would in and of itself be almost revolutionary, I think.
Yeah, but that, Tim, does not necessarily follow from being from Brazil or Mexico or the Philippines, countries with more poverty than in the United States, because the church is also producing very conservative leaders in those countries, or is that not so true?
No, that's true. I mean, I think people say, wouldn't it be great to have a third or a developing world pope from Africa, for example, but some of the churches in Africa are more conservative than churches in Europe or in the United States. So, and there's also the question of, can somebody from outside of the European society run the bureaucracy of the Vatican. I mean, Dave can speak to this more than I can, but it's very complicated. And even somebody like Joseph Ratzinger, who was had lived there and been part of it for such a long time, had difficulty controlling it. So that's a question.
Well, there's a very interesting article by a priest in the Archdiocese of the District of Columbia, and he talks about wanting in the next pope what he calls a regular guy, someone who maybe has tasted the poverty that you mentioned, someone who, the cardinals, he said, are all cut from the same clerical cloth. They're pretty much insulated and isolated, and they listen to one another, and they're used to a lot of deference, due to their positions. And wouldn't it be something if the Pope came from a large family where he had brothers and sisters, perhaps sisters who practiced birth control, and suppose that he had he had pastoral work. He had worked with the poor. He had fed the hungry. He had been in the streets. He'd seen the impact of crime and poverty. Would he not bring something very different? And it's kind of an interesting dream.
By the way, just to be clear, did you say before that the priest shortage is worse in the United States or not in the United States?
No, it's not worse in the United
Really?
States. I'm saying
it's even worse in some of these other countries.
Oh, yes, yes.
So,
yeah, you have places in Latin America where there's one priest for every 20,000 people.
Yeah, right.
So how does the church keep maintain its relevance for the large Catholic population there? I know Sister Camille said some people are going off to Pentecostalism, but that can't be the only answer.
Well, I think really one thing, if you have a church and a papacy and a Vatican that is less Euro-focused. Look, Benedict was such a man of the old world, and so much of his energies went into promoting a kind of neo-Latinized liturgy and that kind of thing, which has no relevance in so many of these parts of the world. If you have somebody who's willing to adapt the church to the culture, to the worship style, we always talk about positions and doctrines and what's going to change. Religion and Catholicism is a lived religion. It's about that relationship. It's not, most Catholics aren't focused on what happens in Rome or even in their own diocese. They could barely even name their own bishop. They are focused on what happens on the ground in their parish.
Right. And so, Tim, along those lines, do you think that the church under Benedict has become more relevant to American Catholics, less relevant, or no change?
I think, if anything, probably a little less relevant. I mean, I think the sexual abuse crisis played a part there because that's been ongoing for the last 10 years, and I think more and more American Catholics have been alienated because of that, so that's a part of it. Part of it is just the personality of Benedict. He doesn't have quite the charisma of John Paul, so people who felt connected to John Paul didn't have the same connection. So if anything, it's less relevant.
I think that the church under this, John Paul, it started with John Paul and certainly with Benedict, there is a divisive force at work within the church, and that is those people who would bring us back before Vatican II to the Tridentine Mass, which is being celebrated again in Latin with the priests back to the people, and that has been encouraged by the current administrations. And then you have those who, like myself, have the 50-year memory of the Second Vatican Council, and we are appalled that there would be such a division.
If anything, Benedict was cracking down on your generation of nuns.
Yes, you're right. I'd like to talk, if I may,
Please.
speak about the one installation of a pope that I witnessed and the press conference that I attended, and it was that of John Paul I, the pope we had for 30 days. I didn't go to Rome particularly excited about this event, but I did have my press credentials. I was there on vacation and got press credentials and attended it. And the day after the installation, Pope John Paul I had a press conference for journalists. And of course, I was there. 2/3 of the room were print journalists like myself, and about 1/3 were the electronic media. And this Pope, with this enormous smile and just always on the brink of laughter and joy, he said, if St. Paul were alive today, he would be a journalist. And of course, the room just went wild with cheers. And then he said, no, I take it back. He said, if St. Paul were alive today, he would be the head of the largest television network in the world, the better to communicate to all people the power of God's love. And from that moment, I took my view of what a pope should be, a pope who could communicate to all people in their own language the truth of God's love.
CNN, the Catholic News Network, under Paul.
And Pope Benedict took small steps. I mean, he was on Twitter, Pontifex being his handle there. And he spoke about, exercising more charity in social media and on the web. So he tried to take small steps. I think the next Pope will have to take longer steps, but he is heading in. He did it kind of start the conversation.
Yeah.
Do we need to judge Benedict by the sexual abuse scandal and how effectively he dealt with it? History may remember this era as defined by that. Will they remember this Pope well or badly in terms of how he dealt with it?
I'd be interested in Dave and Sister Camille as well, but I think it's going to be a mixed bag. I mean, I think on the institutional level, a lot of people are still frustrated that certain bishops were not disciplined for Cardinal Law being the prime example, still has position in Rome. On the other hand, he showed a real pastoral touch when he came to this country, when he went to Britain. He met with people who suffered from abuse and was widely applauded for doing so and didn't make a big deal out of it. He didn't announce that he was going to do it. He just did it. So I think it's going to be a mixed bag. At least that's the way I see it.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Dave,
Yeah, very much so.
Even been speculation. I know when I do a call-in radio show in the morning, I can easily fill up the board just by mentioning the topic with people who want to speculate that there's something that Benedict knows that is going to surface about what he knew or about what people very close to him knew and covered up, and that's one of the reasons that he stepped down. Do you think there's any possibility that that was a contributing cause?
Well, I think anything's possible in the Catholic Church. Dan Brown made a fortune off of speculating about those things. But no, not really. Look, after the Vati leaks scandal, I mean, everything came out that could possibly come out, and it showed that the Vatican was a place full of the Renaissance court of intrigue and backbiting. Was that a shock to anybody? Really, the Pope had been sending signals about this resignation for so long, for years. It was shocking, but it shouldn't have been a surprise. I just don't think there's any smoking gun there that has yet to be revealed.
Dave, some people are gone but not forgotten. He may wind up forgotten but not gone. If he continues to write, and he is a writer, he's an intellectual, he likes to put his views down and his interpretations of things, is he free to express himself? It's so unprecedented in modern history. Is he free to disagree in any way with his successor if he feels like he disagrees?
Well, I think personally, I'd say, yeah, obviously he is free to disagree, and he likes to be outspoken, he likes to write, but I don't think it would be appropriate in any way, shape, or form. He just said just a bit ago that he will be hidden from the world in this monastery in the Vatican. So he seems to be, willing to sort of just disappear, which seems unusual. I still don't know if that's going to be an ideal resolution. I wouldn't be surprised to see him move back to his native Bavaria at some point, to have this kind of shadow pope living right there on the grounds of the Vatican.
Sister Camille, same question?
I would be surprised. I think he has enough wisdom and enough prudence not to be an interfering presence. His influence is going to be sufficiently felt by the person who replaces him, probably, but surely by the cardinals who are still there and the bureaucracy that still unfolds that, because he has appointed 67 of the 117 cardinals who are going to be there, and he chose men after his own liking. So his influence is already there.
So how quickly are they going to choose a new pope, Tim, after February 28th?
I think it'll be within a week or 10 days or so. I mean, it was very quick. I think 2 days in the last conclave. But it's a question of how well they know each other, and who. That part of the issue is that Ratzinger was elected last time because everybody knew him and he was so close to John Paul. So it'll be interesting whether somebody who is sort of a dark horse emerges.
Well, they'll tweet instead of send up a puff of smoke this time, right?
Right.
What do you call an ex-pope?
That's a good
How would
question.
you address him if you came upon him?
I mean, I think he's a cardinal, so that would be one.
So he goes back to Cardinal Ratzinger?
Cardinal Ratzinger. Papa is one, Papa Ratzinger, that somebody had mentioned as a potential title.
That's too close to paparazzi. We
I
don't
know,
want
you
that.
can't.
No.
Actually, you can't.
Poppy.
I think they're going to call him the Bishop Emeritus of Rome. You can't even have an ex-pope. You can't even call him a Pope Emeritus. You can only have one pope. There's even a question of whether he'll be Cardinal Ratzinger because he's renounced all governance in the church, and a cardinal still has a role of governance. So some say he may just get busted back to Father Joseph Ratzinger.
Thank you all very much for a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, If Mayors Ruled the World, with political theorist Benjamin Barber. Whether it's climate change, environmental degradation, or organized crime, a case can be made that cities around the world, including New York, are doing a better job than sovereign nation states at addressing tough problems and even cooperating across borders. Maybe the American public senses this because confidence in Congress hovers around 20% at best. Presidents usually have less than 50%, while confidence in mayors is closer to 65%, according to the polls. And who is making the case for cities as responsive and effective? Well, political theorist Benjamin Barber, author of If Mayors Ruled the World. Professor Barber is senior research scholar at the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society at the CUNY Graduate Center, and he founded the Interdependence Movement, which we'll get to. Hi, Ben. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Brian.
What got you thinking about mayors versus presidents and other heads of state?
Well, you said in your lead-in exactly right that I wasn't thinking about cities, I was thinking about states and how dysfunctional they have become in the setting.
You mean nation states? Or
Literally nation states,
Yeah.
yeah, nation states, France, China, the US. They have become dysfunctional when it comes to global relations, global governance. There is no one to turn to on global governance of the environment, global governance on gun running, global governance on nuclear proliferation, global governance on predatory markets. We have the G20, we have the Bretton Woods institutions, the international financial institutions, but we don't really have anywhere to go. The UN is paralyzed by the Security Council in security matters. The General Assembly is a talkathon where nothing really can get done. The Secretary General's office tries to act, but doesn't really have the clout or the influence to do it other than by the moral suasion. So the result is there's no one who can really cooperate globally around all the global issues we face.
But can cities communicate with each other? Like if they're trying to solve climate change, for example, can New York talk to Mexico City and talk to Beijing without the national governments as the infrastructure to actually get something done?
Well, not only can they do. They do it one-on-one a lot, but they also increasingly do it through intercity networks. And I was astounded when I began to do research on this book a couple of years ago. The book was originally called just If Mayors Ruled the World, in the subjunctive, the conditional. But I have a kind of working subtitle of why they should and how they already do, because the more work I did, the more I realized it was actually happening. And in climate change, which you mentioned, there are organizations like the C40, started by Clinton and Bloomberg and some others. It's now 58 cities that are cooperating one-on-one and multilaterally across city boundaries. There's a group called ICLE, the International Environmental Group for Combating Climate Change, that has been in existence for 30 years, and in which there are over 300 cities working together. And here's the deal, in answer to your question about can they do it, what about states? 80% of carbon emissions, roughly, come out of cities. That means whatever cities can do, one-on-one by themselves and with others to do, they can have a profound impact. And if they want to put in bike lanes and bike share programs, pedestrian zones, congestion fees, if they want to limit, as some cities have, the carbon emissions on the trucks that go in the ports, like they do in Los Angeles today, they can do all of that. In Los Angeles, they've eliminated about half of the emissions coming out of the port. The port had 40% of all of carbon emissions for LA. So Mayor Villaraigosa has actually done a tremendous job on his own, by himself, of changing the carbon profile of Los Angeles.
Why do you think mayors are more effective than heads of state? Is it just that they run smaller units, that they're closer to the people, that the kinds of decisions they have to make are more on the ground? What are the main reasons?
Well, you say, is it just that? Yes, but it's not just. I mean, you just named some pretty important things. And it is those things and others like them. I mean, the biggest thing, I think, is that national political figures, prime ministers and presidents, adhere to great historical norms, national ideologies, political ideologies, great political principles. Mayors have to fix things. They have to solve problems. They have to get the garbage picked up everywhere. They got to plow the snow. They got to make sure that the unemployed have somewhere to eat and live. The homeless have a place to go. If they're undocumented workers, illegal people in the country, they can't worry about what happens at the borders. They have to worry about what they do about the folks who are living amongst them. They're problem solvers. That makes them pragmatic. That's number one. The second thing is I like to say mayors are homeboys. You know, they're from their regions. The President of the United States, you know, you might see him on TV. Very few people ever see him in person. Same with prime ministers, same with President of China, presidents of Bolivia. But a mayor, he walks the streets. We've heard stories of Mayor Booker over in Newark running into a building and pulling out some people. We've heard of Mayor Nutter in Philadelphia intervening in a crime. We've heard Mayor Johnson in London helping somebody who had a heart attack on the street. Mayors are homeboys, they're neighbors, they're your neighbors. Most people at some point have either seen or passed by or even said a word or two to a mayor. He's one of us. So he has a responsibility, has a relationship to the community and the neighborhood. That word neighborhood is wonderful. You know, I mean, mayors are mayors of neighborhoods. The United States of America, the Republic of China is not a neighborhood.
And when you talk about mayors walking the streets, I'm thinking of that image that's been around so much lately since Mayor Koch passed away, of him walking across the Brooklyn Bridge with throngs of New Yorkers during the transit strike once upon a time, which was a very connecting moment for him early in his administration.
It was too, in his famous mantra, how am I doing? I mean, probably most presidents are nervous and anxious and would love to ask the question and have the pollsters do it for them, but you can't imagine Obama coming on national television saying, how am I doing? But for a mayor to say, hey guys, how am I doing? That's a natural, and every mayor in a way says to his constituents, how am I doing?
Now, you tend to be a politically progressive person, but one of the things that we often hear from the Republican Party is to turn federal programs back to the states, like food stamps and things like that. Never mind that the states maybe never had those programs to get them turned back to, but the reason that they give is that more local government is closer to the people and the Washington bureaucracy is more likely to fail. Is that consistent or contradictory with what you believe?
Well, it's a complicated question because we live in a tripartite confederal system. We have a national government, a state or provincial, they would say, elsewhere, a government, county government, and then we have municipalities. And of course, what the Republicans love to do is take it away from the federal government, which is fairly progressive, give it to the states, which, depending on where you are, can be quite conservative. They don't want to go too far back to the people. They don't want to give it to the cities, because when you give it to the cities, as Paul Ryan complained after the recent election, the cities are blue. Cities are progressive. People are open, transparent. We have immigrants, we have gays, we have people who go there because they're excited about creativity, mobility. They want to get into the arts. They want to do new things. That makes cities a fabulous place to do things that look to the future, that are optimistic, that are involved in trade and immigration and so on, but it also does make them progressive and blue. And the Republicans are in a kind of funny position because they want to send things back down the pipeline, but I think they'd like it to stop roughly at, they'd like to stop at Trenton and Albany. They don't want it to go to Newark and New York.
Do you think that's one of the reasons, in your opinion, why mayors are so effective, is that they tend to have liberal mindsets?
Well, I think they have to, and it's not, again, I hate they have urban mindsets, and urbanity, as the word itself suggests, cosmopolitanism, is the attitude of people who are open, who are communicating, who like the arts. I mean, the kids who leave farm towns in Nebraska and South Dakota, or farm villages in Brazil and go to Rio, or go to Sao Paulo. They go because they are drawn to the openness, the possibility, the culture of big cities. So big cities in their urbanity are in that sense progressive, but it's not progressive in the sense that they always come down on the liberal side and rather than the conservative side. It's that we live in times of digital communication, of global transportation, of people traveling and moving everywhere, of immigration, more immigration than ever before. We live in a highly mobile, communicative world, and cities reflect that, and the countryside doesn't. So I'd rather than saying cities are liberal, saying cities are where the future is going. Cities are where we're going. By the way, up until a few years ago, more than half the people in the world didn't live in cities. Starting just a couple of years ago, UN Habitat reported more than half of the peoples in the world live in cities. They figure it'll be 60 or 70% 20 or 30 years from now. In the West, it's already 78% of the population live in cities. The cities are our future.
Do you see immigration differently than some other people might? Does it lead you to think more that there should be open borders than some other people might, because the real relationship should be city to city rather than some notion of the nation state?
Well, I do. We might say, by the way, there are open borders. The reality is,
whether we like it or not, whether the government likes it or not.
Whether the government likes it or not, there are open borders, but the reality is you have to deal with that problem where the immigrants grow, and a great many of them go initially to the cities. In time, they go on to the suburbs and elsewhere, but they start into the cities. That's where they start, which means mayors have to deal with both documented and undocumented, legal and illegal workers. That's just a reality for them, and I think they worry less about should they be there than how are we going to treat them, how are we going to deal with their health needs, how are we going to deal with their criminal records, how are we going to deal with all that stuff. And that, again, is the pragmatism of mayors. One of the great things that's happening in cities around the world is that cities are talking about a program they called city visas. That's when you have undocumented folks coming in. The city says, we'll give you a visa. It'll be a city visa. The country may or may not recognize it. We'll recognize it. It'll get you into our schools and our hospitals. It'll put you in our criminal justice system so we know who you are. You commit a crime, we're going to come after you. But you will be we will document you with a city visa. So there the city is almost taking on a sovereign function and saying, we're doing it because we know you're there. And so all we want to do is get you on the record.
So mayors are closer to the people, but you also founded the Interdependence Movement, which I see has as part of its mission statement, if we're going to flourish in liberty, we must either globalize democracy or democratize globalization.
Right, and for 12 years since 9/11, we have been meeting around the world every year in a 3 or 4 day event with artists and political leaders and students and professors and religious folks and so on, civil society leaders. But we've been doing it not in the States. We haven't done it in Italy, France, Morocco, and Turkey. We've done it in Rome, Paris, Casablanca, Istanbul, Berlin, Los Angeles last year, next year Dublin. We are doing it in cities because cities, interestingly, though they are neighborhoods linked to local sentiment and local feeling, it is also the cities that are working together globally. So oddly, cities are much more global and cosmopolitan in their perspective than states, whose borders, whose sovereignty, whose national language and national cultures build walls around them. In the old days, we had walled towns and open borders. Today, we have walled states and open cities.
I know that another of your interests is the connection between the arts and democracy. Does that link to cities too?
Well, does it ever? I mean, just think about anything from museums to universities to research centers to art galleries to theaters to filmmaking, anything you want to think about.
They tend to be in cities, but what's the relationship to democracy?
People go to cities in part because the arts are there. The relation to democracy is that there is a deep and most important human faculty, imagination. And imagination is at the core of the arts. Creativity comes out of imagination. The ability to imagine is everywhere in the arts, and it's key to democracy because the citizen is an ordinary person who is able to imagine in others very different than them, different language, different race, different religion, different background. Imagine someone who has common interests. Imagine a common human being. Imagination is the commonality that links artistic creativity to democratic citizenship, which is why, by the way, I want arts taught in every school in the world because you don't just teach creativity, you teach democracy.
At the other extreme, I think I heard that Al-Qaeda faction that took over part of Mali actually banned music. It was some faction like that somewhere.
Indeed.
I think it was
the
that.
Puritans.
Should you see that as a political act, not just a religious one?
It is a political act, and of course the Puritans also banned dance and banned music. I mean, Orthodox religious people everywhere have always been afraid of art because they're afraid of imagination. And imagination creates a ecumenical religion, a religion of all humanity, but it's very bad for the narrow, culturally defined religions that want to see themselves as an extension of a particular language, a particular race, and a particular people, the way the Orthodox side of whether it's Hinduism or Christianity or Islam do.
So what's the role of national leadership in this vision that you have of if mayors rule the world or the way things are actually going. I mean, when President Obama gives a State of the Union address and comes out with some very concrete proposals like universal pre-K or the specific gun legislation, that's supposed to connect right back to the streets of cities, isn't it?
It is indeed, and that's where the majority of the American population live, and that's where the majority of the problems are, and that's where the solutions have to be. And of course, if you go through his, whether it's gun control, whether it's early education, 4-year-old education, whether it's university education, everything he talks about, transportation, it comes back to cities. That's where the majority of people are. So national leaders, when they know what they're doing and they understand the times in which they live, of course are going to embrace cities. That's not to say you don't also embrace the fact that the other half of the population lives in the countryside. They have interests. They have to be accommodated as well. But we live in a skewed political system. Because we were an agrarian republic, because the Senate is skewed to represent minority population areas, we live in a country where the majority of urban people are ruled in effect by the paralysis of those in the countryside. And that is the way in which the Tea Party, small 20% of the people from the countryside mostly, paralyze the urban majority and prevent them from solving the problems of both the city and the countryside. So we need a political system that reflects where the urban majority is, where the problems are, and also where the solutions are. Because when you solve the problems in the cities, you solve the problem for the country.
Benjamin Barber, always great to talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Brian.
Can New York apartments get any smaller? Incredibly, the answer is yes, but smaller can be done better. So up next, your 300 square foot castle. Get ready, New York. Your housing options are about to get downsized, but in a good way. In response to the growing need for new housing alternatives for a city population that just keeps on growing, the mayor's office recently held the Adapt NYC micro-unit housing design competition. That's a mouthful, but the winner is in. And joining us to discuss our tiny future is N Architects partner Mimi Huang. N Architects designed the winning entry of the Adapt NYC micro-unit competition. Also joining us, Sarah Watson, Deputy Director of the Citizens Housing Planning Council. Watson is the author and manager of the council's Making Room project, which helped inspire the mayor's micro-housing proposal. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
How small are we talking about, Mimi, in your winning entry?
They are on average 285 square feet, but they range from 250 to 350 square feet.
Depending on the size of the family? Or is this all housing for one?
This is mainly housing for 1 and 2 people family units. And based on the research that was done, the Making Room project, we now know that for a long time the city has a shortage of small apartments. And so these younger people are getting priced out, or they just can't find enough apartments that are small enough.
So you're going to walk us through some slides, give people a visual impression of what this is. So here is the view of a building that's going to be constructed from a little bit far from it. Let's move closer in to the next shot. This is going to be constructed in Kips Bay on the east side, right?
Yes, it's on 27th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenue.
And let's go inside. This is just a model. I want to go past this slide to a shot of what an apartment would actually look like. What are we looking at in this cross section?
So you're looking at a studio apartment, and on the right side is what we call the toolbox. It's everything that you need. So it's your kitchen, your bathroom, and an overhead storage compartment plus closet. On the left is your main living space, what we call the canvas. You set it up as you wish. And it basically will be the living space / sleeping space. And all the way to the left of the image are very large windows, sliding doors, in fact, that open onto a Juliet balcony.
So you get a lot of light and that creates space. Is that red couch kind of a sleeper that you can use as a couch or a bed?
Yes, yes. There are many ways to set it up, and furniture is not part of the design, but yes, obviously it won't fit a bed and a sofa, so it's
and this is about 300 square feet, right? Let's go to the next slide, which shows another example of the way the same space can be arranged. But Sarah, you talk to us. What's happening in cities that we need to do something like this?
Well, they're growing massively. I mean, we launched our project in 2007 when the mayor projected that 1 million people were arriving, which is a hugely radical number. And for us, the tools for how to accommodate that, we live on islands, we don't necessarily want to keep building taller and taller. The tools weren't really there for such a radical number. There's really radical growth in cities.
This is by 2030.
By 2030.
We're expected to grow from the
Yes.
current 8 million or so to
Right.
about 9 million.
To about 9, right, and how we can accommodate those people.
And there's already considered to be a permanent housing shortage in New York
Exactly.
City, which is the main reason that rents and prices are so high, right?
Yes. I mean, we started to look at, as well as the growth, how people were really fitting into the current housing stock, because you do know that there's issues currently. There's a very low vacancy rate. We understand that people are, sharing a lot in the kind of Craigslist unofficial culture of sharing. So we started to look at how people are really fitting in the housing stock today. And these trends of single people were everywhere when we broke the households down. The number of people living alone, single people living alone, is 1/3 of all households in New York already.
Right.
Actually, in the States as a whole, it's almost 30%.
So a lot of this is about housing for one.
People living by themselves, yes, it's the growing demographic in the country. And then on the other side is a lot of single people sharing. Actually, 1/4 of all of the homes and apartments in New York have some sort of sharing going on. So you really see these pressures because there's a lack of supply for single adults. And if we're really becoming more and more single, we really need our housing to evolve in
Let's
that
go
way.
back to that same slide of that second apartment we started to show. Sarah, is this also going to be a coup for developers? I can imagine the builders of the world thinking, oh my goodness, how many units we're going to be able to put up and sell, and call a lot of them luxury and modular and all these fancy terms, and make a killing.
Well, the bottom line is developers know where the market is, and the market for single-person housing is huge, and it's not being responded to at the moment. So the answer is that people are having to share and do it illegally. So
Why is
there
it
is a huge market.
Is there anything about this design, by the way, that you want to comment on? I know it's Mimi's company's design.
Well, they're all, I mean, it's incredible in terms of using design techniques to enhance small spaces, and also embracing new technology and getting
Such
the
as
light
what?
in.
Like, what about this made it the winning entry?
I think that's a question for you.
Okay,
right?
Mimi, go ahead, take it away.
I wasn't involved in
And
any of the decision making.
Don't be modest.
I won't be. I think the city chose the team. Obviously, they like the design, but I think they chose the team. And our partners are Monadnock Development and the Actors Fund. The Actors Fund is going to be very important in the programming of the shared amenity spaces, which we can talk about later.
And here, let's talk about it right now. It's up when you say shared amenity spaces. So we were looking at the individual apartment. This slide shows us some of the shared spaces. For example, to start at the top, I guess that's a rooftop garden, right?
Right, and below that is a terrace, and the room that you see feeding onto the terrace is a salon, so that would be shared by the tenants. The space that they are going to be mainly involved in is the ground floor cultural space, and we think that it's very important that people living in very small spaces feel like they're part of something bigger than the four walls of their apartment. So that ground floor space is going to be theater workshop, dance classes, and available to rent by the tenants.
Library,
Possibly.
things like that.
There are small dens on each floor, so we try to basically take the house and disperse all the spaces throughout the building.
If the demand is there and developers are out there who want to make money, why isn't the supply meeting the demand today?
Well, there are a lot of regulations that evolved in New York specifically to combat the real issues of slum housing at the beginning of the 20th century. So there was great improvements in the quality of housing that has happened. But actually through the 20th century, the laws and codes just kind of kept carrying on without really stepping back and seeing how people were really living and what the needs of the housing stock was. So that the public policy that relates to what you're allowed to build in New York just kept on becoming an idea of, you need bigger housing and we need it that for a family, and that's better. But actually the demographics did not correspond with that desire. So
They were reflecting the nuclear family.
yes.
Which your project shows is not. the
However
majority.
how many family units are built, you can build. New York is not so much. Only 18% of the homes and apartments actually have a nuclear family living without some sort of sharing going on. So the laws and codes, there's a minimum unit size currently in New York in many areas of the city. 400 is 400 square foot, which has been around since the 1980s. There's also restrictions on how many units you're allowed to fit into a building currently in New York, so that really restricts small studios from being built.
You'd like to see that eliminated.
There are things that are going to be waived for this project to test the idea in the market so that it's kind of a new form of density.
The Museum of the City of New York has an exhibit
Yes.
about living in small spaces. This is a slide, I think, from that.
Yes.
Sarah, you're familiar with this? This is called the Arcade in Providence, Rhode Island. This is an actual small apartment in
This is an
Providence.
actual small apartment, yes. We have the exhibition's in partnership with CHPC, our organization, and the museum, and we're really looking at new creative ways to accommodate our diverse households and the growth in cities. So we have a range of design ideas. We have actually built a small studio in the exhibition called the Launchpad. So you can actually feel what a small space is like in the exhibit, and we actually have that's the space that we've actually built
And
in
there's
the exhibition.
another one called
Go
the
around.
Launchpad.
Yes, and we have images of real life designs that are happening in other cities where designers and architects are really trying to respond to these new demographic shifts, specifically for single people, but also extended families and sharing and just more diversity in terms of households.
I'm sure there are some people watching now, Mimi, and thinking, oh, gross, we're becoming Tokyo, and know that they've seen pictures or films or heard stories of these micro spaces that people live in Japan, and they have to fold up all their stuff every day, and they think, oh, I don't want to live like that.
You don't necessarily need to live like that, but this is aimed at the people who can't find or can't enter the housing market in New York because there aren't enough small studios. And what is really important to think about is that many people live like this, but in much worse conditions. So they are living in illegally subdivided apartments. They don't have windows. They don't have proper ventilation. So this is, this is reflecting the changing demographics, but also improving on the quality of the apartment.
And certainly in the examples that we saw, relatively big windows
Huge.
were prevalent.
Yeah. Yeah, the sliding doors are 9 foot tall by around 7 foot wide. We think that if you shrink the size of your apartment, you have to give something back. So you should give higher ceiling heights. You should give more light and air to compensate for the size of the apartment.
So then that's a legal and a zoning challenge, Sarah, isn't it? That if the city is going to allow something like this to become more prevalent, that there be those kinds of standards. So they may be very small, but they're still nice.
Yes.
Rather than a whole 21st century kind of slum.
Right, and that's the task, and that's always what public policy is balancing, and that would be a task for designing these good zoning that supports that.
There are 3 different types of housing. Do I understand that correctly?
For our initiative, we were really focusing from what the demographics were telling us, how people were living. There were really these trends. Single people living alone and not enough choices for them in the housing market. Single people choosing to live together to reduce their costs in housing. And also extended families who are choosing to live together. The mother-in-law is widowed and comes to live, or the family, the relative, cousin. So we really saw that these were housing types that were needed in the marketplace in New York, because that was already how people were living, but not necessarily with a stock that supports that. So in the exhibition, we have a whole range of different creative types, as well as the micro unit. So we have some ideas for single people to be able to share, well-designed units. We also have designs like this one, which is taking a single family house. This is an idea of a bungalow in Ravenswood in Queens, and adding on some accessory dwelling units. This one, we called it the Barnacle House. This is architect Deborah Gans, who added in up to 6 barnacle attachments of self-contained very small units, so they could be rented out by the homeowner. You could have your mother-in-law live in there, maybe would wash and sleep in their unit and then eat with the family. So it's just different ways that design, if the regulations were altered a little so the housing stock could catch up, it's a way that design can actually support how people are already living in Queens in this way, but not necessarily, with the best structure in their house.
And do you see affordable housing as part of this, or affordable housing rules, or special programs?
Yeah, well, there's affordable housing component of the pilot that's going to be built. I mean, you can obviously add subsidy in any way on top of these designs. For us, sharing and extended family models are the perfect way to create affordable housing. That's the ultimate affordable housing for the mother-in-law, who by herself wouldn't really have any other choice in the marketplace.
As opposed to by law with rent controls or anything like that?
Right. I mean, it's the way that everybody finds affordable housing currently, is to share and pool together in some way.
So Mimi, what are we looking at here? Is this construction actually taking place on the site on 27th Street?
Yes, but next year.
This
is a rendering
Yes.
of what it would, faithfully of what it would look like. The units will be built by Capsis. They will be modular prefab in the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. And they are built with all of their interior finishes, with plumbing, electricity, etc. And they are basically stacked almost like Lego, and then the facade goes on after. So what you're looking at is not the facade, that's the waterproofing behind. So it will greatly minimize the construction time on site, which would be very good for the neighborhood. And it also allows us to control quality and to control the schedule.
So what will they rent for, or what will they sell for?
It's rental, 40% is affordable, and the rest will be market rate. So whatever the market is at the time that it finishes.
What would you guess the market would be today if that building were to go up next week with, how many units did you say?
It's going to be about 55 studio apartments. I believe that the average in Manhattan is somewhere around 2,000.
Currently around 2,500 for a studio.
For a studio.
They're very inflated prices because the supply is so low.
Yeah.
So I think they'll be aiming to rent the market for about 2,000 in these.
But the point would be to kind of flood the city with these in all 5 boroughs, right?
I would not say that that's the case, but I think in certain appropriate areas of the city, especially where there's currently high density living.
But you need
and
a
good
lot of them.
transportation.
I mean, 55 units is nothing.
You need
No,
more.
that's not going to put a
You
dent
need
in the...
thousands,
No,
right?
true.
Thousands.
You
if
need,
this is
you need the ability, you need a regulatory framework that will allow the ability of these units to flourish further.
In terms of demand, we are 800,000 studio apartments short.
yeah.
So we do need them.
Yep.
Do you see this addressing the aging of the population? Do you see a lot of seniors living in these apartments?
You can. I mean, I think this development's probably marketed towards young professionals,
Yeah.
but
It is.
there's nothing in the design or
Well, not necessarily this building, but the larger
Yeah.
idea.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yeah. The lack of options for, again, the growing city is the growing single population is a lot of elderly females left by themselves
Is
trying
this
to
an
find.
issue in the mayoral race? Do you necessarily have the support or need the support politically of whoever the next mayor is going to be to make this vision a reality on a large scale?
We will need it. I'm not sure that this is a part of the mayoral campaigns at this point, but yes, the appetite for regulatory reform that would streamline development and allow some more creative types to happen, we would
And you get
need
the
mayoral
sense
support.
that they're mostly in line with you, or you don't know yet?
I think everybody understands that there has to be responses to growing city and demographic change in the housing stock.
Let's say that this administration is extremely
supportive.
supportive and
Yeah.
extremely, supportive of this pilot project. We'll see
And I
where.
gather the Museum of the City of New York exhibit is up until September,
Yes.
right? So you can go and see some of
Making
those
room.
small space designs, and thank you both very much
Thank you.
Thank you.
for discussing this with us. And that is our program for this week. We debut a new show each Wednesday evening at 7:30, and tune into my radio program each weekday morning at 10 on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, how fashion reflects ethnic and national identity. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.